This is really a great honor and privilege for me to be here participating in this conversation on the topic that is so very important and timely. And it is a very rare opportunity for someone like me from the States and working on Korean history to be meeting so many scholars and students. And so I really like to thank the organizers of this conference, and especially Dean Lee Seok-jae, Dean of the School of the Humanities at Seoul National University, and the organizer of this very, again, important panels of today, Professor Young-Ju Ryu. So I'm sorry, I'm one of those people who's severely tech challenged and a little wobbly because of the jet lag. So I'm going to have to read my presentation, and I'm going to try to make it in 20 minutes. And I am actually, unlike Professor Lee, who's followed the instruction very closely, I think I am departing from the general framework of this conference, and I'm so sorry about that. Basically, what I'm trying to present today is to share with you some of the issues that has preoccupied me for the last several years. Some of it is in my forthcoming book. Some of it is something that I still need to work out. So I try to sort of come up with three different, perhaps, keywords, and that is the discourse of de-democratization, politics of time, and the neoliberal disavowal. And I'm hoping to be able to unpack what I mean by these three different keywords. I'm not sure if I will be successful, but anyway, so that's my attempt today. South Korea's post-1987 transition to democracy was momentous enough that the scholars designated the term 1987년 체제 to denote its significance and how it came to, or how it continues to shape today's political landscape. Even the specific names used by the post-1987 administration, such as the civilian government of Kim Il-sung, the government of the people of Kim Dae-jung, and the participatory government of Roh Moo-hyun, were imbued with optimism about the progress of history and the hopefulness of the post-1987 era, while debates continue among the academics as to whether 1987 or 1997 or 2003 was most critical in terms of introducing real and long-lasting changes to South Korean society. What is certain is that the procedural democracy has settled in, and the sense of irreversible path toward progress has been shared by many in South Korea. Yet the post-1987 democratic transition has cast doubt on the real achievement of the democratization movement and democracy, widely shared disappointment from the less than satisfactory reforms to the dismal economic performances of the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun governments, which saw increasing extremes of polarization in society, led many to be deeply disenchanted within the post-1987 democratization process. A series of economic downturns and financial crises that became known as the IMF crisis caused South Korea's trajectory to veer toward a path of all acceptance of neoliberalism. The financial bailout arranged by the IMF was intended not only to stabilize, but also to radically restructure the domestic economy. And obviously many of you in this room will know the details. The devastating experience of the IMF crisis was such that many Koreans consider the crisis the second toughest experience after the Korean War, the overall relative decline of the quality of life in terms of decline in real income and the sense of increasing insecurity about the future in post-1987 was in sharp contrast to the earlier period, the spectacular economic development of the 1980s, the first of its kind since the time of Tangun, and the concomitant rise of consumerism that gave rise to proliferation of new forms of subjectivities, identities, and desires. And as many of you know, the history of neoliberalism was written in shocks from Augusto Pinochet's Chile and the military dictatorship of Argentina and Uruguay in the 1970s to the rise and fall of Solidarity in Poland and Boris Yeltsin's regime of business oligarchs in Russia in the 1980s and 1990s, sweeping free market reforms ushered in by globalization and neoliberalism involved large-scale collective traumas, violent crisis, and economic shock therapy. All of these previous authoritarian regimes that have recently democratized in Latin America, Asia, and Southeast Asia have also undergone extensive restructuring. The consequences of this restructuring are not only that these countries have often been without corresponding democratic practices or institutions, but also, and perhaps more insidiously, that the democracy they now avow has become a specific kind of democracy, a free market democracy, as it were, giving priority and acquiescing to the demands of neoliberalism. Violence and coercion, albeit of different kinds from the ones administered by past authoritarian regimes, marked the process of that process that led to deregulated capitalism that Professor Michel Jo eloquently actually discussed earlier this morning. And at the same time, the rise of the discourse of the new middle class was a global phenomena, whether in Africa, Asia, Latin America, or Eastern Europe, which also corresponded with the triumphalist discourse of the arrival of mass markets of sovereign consumers. So despite the fragility of middle classness and the ever-present risk of poverty to which many are exposed, political commentators have viewed the middle classes of the world as a promising foundation for sound economic and liberal democracy. And in South Korea, the democratic transition and the concomitant process of neoliberalism also gave rise to what I call the paradigm shift from the 민중 to 시민, from the political to the cultural, and from the collective to the individual. So as in other parts of the world, the primacy of citizen and liberal democracy in both public discourse and social movements became paramount. Citizen here, in practice if not in theory, denoted middle class and signaled that the individuals construct their emancipatory narrative on the liberal principle of individual freedom, formal equality, and political rights as right-bearing and right-claiming citizens. So the liberal democratic state of South Korea, confronted with the global neoliberalism and its demands for institutionalization of market and labor flexibility, also developed a wholesale network of disciplinary mechanisms to induce self-discipline as an integral dimension of subject formation among its citizens. In this context, the widely circulated discourse of liberal democracy during the period of liberal governments in the 1990s and 2000s became transposed into the discourse of neoliberalism. Hence, my discussion or topic of neoliberalism and neoliberal disavowal. So the politics of time is another keyword. Post-1987 also witnessed various attempts and discursive efforts to deny or obscure past emancipatory projects as I can't even speak today, I'm sorry, illegible, sorry. From the Park Chung-hee syndrome to the Romuan government's attempt to legislate the resolution of the issue of pro-Japanese collaborators, to the new rights claim that the history textbooks used by middle and high schools were too critical of South Korea, Korean society has been waging historical debates so fierce and contentious that they have been called a civil war. The transformation in historical judgments in all of these centers on the notion that times have changed, which is why, again, the politics of time is one of the key words, at least for me. So in the era of post-grand narratives, as Rancière notes, a seeming innocuous statement such as times have changed is effortlessly recast into a statement of impossibility. That is to say that the times have changed does not simply denote an actual passage of time and the disappearance of things that had been present in that time period. It also denotes that the possibilities that had been imbued with the idea of time have become impossible, no longer belonging to the present and in the realm of what is possible. And Walter Benjamin's well-known thesis on the philosophy of history offers a similar understanding of time and a view of history where history does not progress according to a prescribed linear trajectory, where there is a deep and abiding connection between the past and the present, especially a connection between the injustice committed in the past and the emancipatory possibility of the present. For Benjamin, the view of history as progress presents twofold dangers. First, a reconfiguration of the history of the past entailing an erasure, distortion, or toning down of subversive dimensions. And secondly, the danger of historical writings falling into complicity with the tendency of the present, aligning with the dominant of contemporary society. A critical view of history is obtained when the view of history as continuous progress is rendered void, and when the historian, and by extension society, sharpen the awareness of the past injustice and engage with the struggle of those who suffered defeat, with all their aspirations, dreams unfulfilled. So arising from the profound and wide-ranging transformations both in and outside of Korea, the politics of time has largely worked to disavow the revolutionary politics of the 20th century in general. And my point actually is that this is not specific or limited to South Korea, and this is actually a global phenomena. But obviously, in particular to South Korea, the disavowal of the past Minjung project. This politics of time is not unique to or specific to the new right in South Korea. And I think that this is a point that I think many of you already made in previous presentations. In the global annals of democracy, for example, the discourse of de-democratization has dominated, which asserts that despite hegemony of democratic rhetoric, democracy today has been entirely emptied of meaning to the point of being reduced to a floating signifier by unregulated capital, the separation of the economy from the political, and substitution of the political rationality of neoliberalism from for democratic rationality. And as many of you know already too well, neoliberalism is much more than economic or trade policies or change in the relationship between the state and economy. It has become a governing rationality that extends specific formulation of economic values, practices, and metrics to every dimension of human life. In the process of disseminating the model of the market to all domains and activities, human beings are reconfigured exhaustively as market actors, as Homo economicus. And this is part of my sort of contention. This is where the neoliberal disavowal comes in, when human beings are reconfigured as Homo economicus. And so, in some ways, alongside paradigm shifts in political and economic spheres, the contestation over history and memory, the domain of knowledge production, has emerged as one of the more distinctive features of the byproducts of neoliberal rationality in South Korea. Public discussions of the legacies of Japanese colonial rule and the Park Chung-hee regime, and the revision of textbooks initiated by the New Right, have shown the extent of neoliberal rationality, the economization of human life in all of its aspects, including the most basic cultural and ethical values that inform one's view of the past. I know in the morning, Professor Morban wanted to end his remarks in a positive note. I know Professor Young-Ji Ryu also wanted to end her remarks in positive note. And here I am, also following the footsteps of these two presenters and wanting to recover some of the political imaginaries that has been, in a way, pushed aside. And that's the currents of the resistance. So in the past several years, the world has witnessed wide-ranging expressions of people who refuse to go along with the status quo and against the tide of neoliberalism, from India, Turkey, and Brazil to Ukraine and the Balkans, to Spain, Greece, Arab, and Chile, and to North America and Northern Europe. The most intense and prolonged protests have taken place in the neo-capitalist Second World and in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and emerging economies. Protesters included not only the inflation-hit middle class, but also underachieving youth, new proletarians, such as the large number of college degree holders in Brazil who are working in telemarketing or other low status and low wage mech jobs, and the poor and downtrodden. They took to the streets to protest the commercialization of public space and services, corrupt and repressive regimes, and their austerity programs against eviction and for access to water and electricity. In fact, despite the Western media's representation of the participants of the Arab Spring as mostly educated, middle class, and tech-savvy, the majority of the people who took to the streets in Cairo and elsewhere came from subaltern classes, the unemployed, rural poor, and slum dwellers, among others. The overarching theme of their protests was a rejection of neoliberal capitalism, as well as a political demand for democracy. And as obviously many of you know only too well in South Korea as well, with the erosion of basic labor rights and meaningful form of workplace leverage, there has been an explosion of struggles by irregular workers, such as private home tutors, golf caddies, janitors, insurance salespersons, cafeteria workers, hotel cleaners, retail cashiers, and subcontracted workers. And I don't think I need to belabor this point. I have a brief sort of summarization of what those struggles have been about. But I would like to actually mention about the young people in South Korea, that even in their distrust, even as their distrust and loathing of society and the government, as shown in their frequent invocation of Hell Joseon, seem to have reached a point of no return, have become actively engaged in various kinds of activities to challenge the status quo. And again, I think many of you would know the names of Kim Ye-sul, Ju Hyun-woo, and Kim Chang-in, who refused to attend or expel themselves from the university, claiming that the university has become a broker to trade certificates, or that the university was becoming the exclusive property of a corporation. So the above students' declarations were a wake-up call for the society that has not adequately dealt with the issues that the term Hell Joseon encapsulates. South Korea has the world's longest working hours, as well as the highest suicide rates and lowest birth rates in the world. Many of its youth feel that their only choice is to leave the country or to become an insect. But as the contributors to the volume, 노력의 배신, remind us, youth are also engaged in various creative ways to respond to the issues at hand. Since the 1990s, there have been many experimental and communal living in which members purchase or rent a place collectively, which functions as a place for liberation, for play, for work, as well as a place to live, all at the same time, as in the case of the people of our village at the outskirts of Seoul. So while some of the examples that I discussed in the presentation or in the paper, actually I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to skip about the candlelight protest. So some of these examples that I discuss in my paper may seem marginal and ineffectual for overcoming the onslaught of neoliberal capitalism and the current status quo, and may at first glance seem unmoored from the lineages of previous social movements. But my contention is that they draw upon collective memories of past struggles, retrieving and reclaiming moments from the past that have been either forgotten or wrested away to make palatable dominant trends of the present. They also share what Kristen Ross has poignantly summed up as communal luxury, a set of criteria or system of valuation other than the one supplied by the market for deciding what a society values, what it counts as precious. At moments of historical retreat, and I actually think of this particular moment that we are in as a moment of political retreat, hence the sense of urgency. A different understanding of time is required rather than rely on a historicist conception of linear teleological time, in which case we would only see the defeat. An understanding of the dialectic processes of political changes that unfold in a temporal tension between continuities and discontinuities, ruptures and closures, advances and retreat is required. So the politics of time that the New Right revisionist historiography engages in, which discursively assign as past or anachronistic all those phenomena that do not accommodate contemporary society's hegemonic ideal, also vindicates contemporaries in relation both to injustice that happened in the past, as well as to a present that has not rendered justice for a past historical injustice. To make amends for the previously unacknowledged suffering of the past generation, and to make efforts to continue the unconcluded struggle of the past is to open up a possibility for true emancipation of society, and mapping out these contradictory contours of the upsurges of the people, demos, and the violent and coercive neoliberal disavowal, I think would be very crucial task for Korean studies, however you define Korean studies and wherever one is located, to critically intervene in contemporary development. Thank you so much.